45 degrees Celsius is the peak temperature reached during the summer months in the Negev desert, creating an environment where any form of agriculture seems physically impossible. This territory remains one of the most arid and inhospitable regions on the planet, receiving almost zero rainfall throughout the entire year. For thousands of years, human civilizations have struggled to maintain even the simplest long-term farming practices in these sands. Why would anyone attempt to establish commercial aquaculture in a landscape devoid of surface water? It would seem that the lack of moisture and the extreme heat would immediately terminate such an ambitious project. But in reality, millions of tropical fish are currently being farmed in this specific region for international export. The process is only gaining momentum. One can notice how vast sailing ponds filled with warm water stretch across the desert floor, creating a stark visual contrast against the surrounding barren dunes. These facilities produce fish that compete directly with specimens caught in the open ocean, eventually reaching markets across the European continent. It is visible how the equipment maintains the structural integrity of these artificial ecosystems despite the relentless sun. But this is just the beginning. The technical approach does not rely on traditional methods of land reclamation or the massive consumption of scarce resources. Israel is not achieving these results by attempting to conquer the desert through brute force or the pumping of massive quantities of fresh water from distant sources. The engineering strategy avoids heavy reliance on expensive desalination plants and does not seek to transform the Negev into fertile land through standard irrigation. It only looks obvious that such a venture would require endless water supplies. But in reality, the solution lies in a different technical dimension. Everything only gets more complicated as one examines the underlying logistics of the operation. Automated systems monitor the salinity and mineral content of the ponds to ensure the tropical species thrive in the heat. The camera glides along the perimeter of the desert basins where the water surface remains still and controlled. This specialized infrastructure allows for the commercial cultivation of aquatic life in a zone where humans have historically failed to sustain basic crops. The transformation of the arid landscape into a high-tech production hub follows a logic that bypasses the limitations of the local climate. The operation continues to scale without the need for traditional fertile soil. This stage of the development represents a fundamental shift in how desert resources are utilized for food production. Thus, the desert aquaculture system reaches a state of stable output, preparing the fish for their journey to distant markets. 13,000 square kilometers of scorched terrain. This is the Negev, a geographical entity that serves as a relentless test of physical endurance. During the 1950s, David Ben-Gurion, the founding father of the State of Israel, proposed a vision that many contemporary observers categorized as architectural madness. Why attempt to make an arid wasteland bloom when the environment remains so brutally unforgiving? At that time, summer temperatures reached extreme levels while surface water sources were virtually non-existent, creating a landscape defined by total thermal hostility. The dream of transforming the South faced immediate and severe physical barriers. Attempts to divert water from the Sea of Galilee through the national water carrier encountered fierce opposition from neighboring countries and the rigid constraints of local geology. Israel gradually realized that relying solely on atmospheric precipitation would lead to inevitable failure. In the Negev, life was not a narrative of gradual development, but a stark problem of survival, where every technical mistake resulted in systemic collapse. For several decades, the region functioned primarily as a site for military installations and small, scattered communities that managed to exist by conserving every individual drop of water. This extreme aridity did not merely mean a lack of drinking water, it effectively strangled all potential for economic growth. The process of adaptation is only gaining momentum. It was precisely in this state of extreme thirst that Israeli scientists ceased looking at the sky for rain and instead focused their attention deep into the earth beneath their feet. One can notice how the equipment gradually penetrates the surface to uncover secrets buried for tens of thousands of years. In 1973, during a geological exploratory drilling operation, researchers accidentally discovered a massive body of water located more than 2,300 feet below the desert floor. This aquifer originates from the Nubian system, situated directly beneath one of the driest regions in the Middle East. Billions of cubic meters of water remain locked within porous rock layers that date back to prehistoric times. But this was no ordinary water source, as it possessed unique chemical and physical properties. It was fossil water, formed during an era when the climate of North Africa was still humid and lush. Because it is not replenished by modern rainfall, the volume is finite. One can observe that this is brackish water, occupying a middle ground between fresh water and the sea. Dissolved within the liquid are minerals such as magnesium, calcium, and potassium. These elements are present at concentrations high enough to kill most agricultural agricultural crops within just a few days of exposure. Everything only gets more complicated when analyzing the utility of such a resource. For much of the world, this subterranean reservoir would be considered nearly useless for human or industrial application. However, by the early 1990s, scientists at the Jacob Blaustein Institutes for Desert Research began to evaluate the aquifer through a different technical lens. It seems simple to dismiss salty water, but in reality, its depth provides a significant advantage. Because the Nubian water lies so far underground, it maintains a stable temperature of approximately 38 degrees Celsius. This thermal consistency remains completely unaffected by cold winter cycles or modern surface pollution. The camera glides along the conceptual maps of this warm, stable fossil ocean, which remains isolated from the atmosphere like a prehistoric time capsule waiting to be opened. It is visible how the geological layers act as a pressurized seal for the ancient liquid, and it was here that a critical technical question emerged among the research teams. Why didn't Israel, a nation already renowned for its advanced desalination technology, simply process this fossil resource into fresh water immediately? The answer involves a complex balance of energy, chemistry, and the specific needs of the desert ecosystem. The ancient reservoir remains in place, prepared for the next stage of technological intervention. 100% of the domestic water supply for most of the Israeli population originates from the massive desalination plants lining the Mediterranean coast. This dominance in water technology has established the nation as a global leader in the field of hydraulic engineering. Why not simply construct extensive pipeline networks from the sea into the Negev, or desalinate the brackish groundwater reservoirs lying directly beneath the desert sands? The answer to this technical challenge is found not in the limits of engineering, but in the strict realities of economics and energy consumption. Modern desalination infrastructure relies primarily on reverse osmosis technology, which utilizes extremely high pressure to force raw water through ultrafine membranes to strip away salt molecules. This mechanical process demands enormous quantities of electricity to maintain the necessary atmospheric force, requiring complex pumping systems and generating continuous operating costs that never cease. One can notice how the equipment gradually consumes megawatts of power to produce a single cubic meter of fresh water. But this is just the beginning. While such systems are highly effective for providing urban drinking water, they become an immense financial burden when applied to large-scale industrial agriculture. Each individual hectare of desert crops may require tens of millions of gallons of water per year to remain viable in the heat. Under these conditions, the production cost of agricultural goods would skyrocket, rendering them entirely uncompetitive on the international market. And this is not the limit of the complications facing the region. Desalination also produces brine, which is a highly concentrated saline wastewater heavily loaded with residual salts and minerals. Along the Mediterranean coast, this brine can be safely diluted and discharged back into the deep ocean currents. However, in the isolated environment of the Negev desert, the management of brine becomes an almost unsolvable technical problem. It is visible how the fragile ecosystem reacts to chemical shifts. If this concentrated salt were released into the arid soil, it would destroy vital microorganisms and disrupt the fundamental soil structure. The process is only gaining momentum as engineers seek alternatives to avoid long-term damage to the environment. Israel eventually realized that a smarter, more integrated approach was required to utilize the desert's resources. It was not a matter of turning every drop of saline water into fresh water for conventional crops, but rather finding a specific organism that could thrive in a stream of hot, salty water. At first glance, the desert seems inhospitable to life, but in reality, this thermal brine became an ideal habitat. This was the precise moment when tropical fish entered the technical picture. The focus shifted from expensive filtration to the biological potential of the existing groundwater. The material is ready to move to the next processing phase without haste. 1/10 of the salinity found in typical seawater turned out to be the hidden biological key for an unconventional industrial shift. Why would anyone attempt to cultivate aquatic life in the center of a parched wasteland? It only looks obvious to assume that a desert is the least suitable place for such an enterprise, but in reality, the subterranean environment of the Negev provided a perfect chemical match for high-value species. Israeli scientists discovered that the brackish groundwater sitting in deep aquifers mirrored the natural habitats of several premium fish. Barramundi, frequently referred to as Asian sea bass, became a primary focus of this desert transition. This ancient species naturally populates the estuaries and brackish transition zones spanning from Australia to Southeast Asia. In these wild settings, the fish seek out areas where fresh and salt water merge under a constant sun. They follow a specific life cycle, spawning in the ocean before migrating upstream into river systems. This evolutionary background gifted the species with a unique ability to withstand fluctuating salinity and high heat. But this is just the beginning. Such biological traits make the barramundi notoriously difficult to farm in the colder climates of North America or Europe. One can notice how northern facilities struggle during the winter months as outdoor temperatures plummet below survival thresholds. To compensate, these farms must operate massive heating systems that burn through fossil fuels and electricity at an unsustainable rate. High energy consumption inevitably inflates the final market price, making the product uncompetitive against global imports. In the Negev, however, the fundamental laws of geography work in favor of the producer. The groundwater drawn from the earth arrives at the surface already warm, maintaining a steady thermal profile throughout every season. No external heaters are installed. No additional fuel is burned to stabilize the environment. What was once viewed as the primary disadvantage of the desert, the relentless heat, is transformed into a source of free industrial energy. It gets more complex further on as researchers expanded the scope of the project. Alongside the barramundi, scientists integrated tilapia and European sea bass into the production cycle. These species share a high tolerance for salt and adapt rapidly to the confines of controlled aquaculture. Starting in the early 2000s, the landscape began to change as specialized farms appeared on land previously dismissed as worthless. The equipment gradually moved in to excavate vast earthen ponds and pour industrial-scale concrete tanks in rapid succession. Groundwater is pumped from the deep aquifers, where it is immediately and continuously aerated to maintain oxygen levels. These tanks are then stocked with hundreds of thousands of fish, creating a dense and productive environment. The results exceeded initial projections because the water chemistry so closely matched the evolutionary needs of the livestock. Within a few years, the region became one of the most efficient hubs for fish production in the country. By the late 2000s, the annual output of the desert farms surpassed 3,000 tons. At first glance, this seems like a local achievement, but in reality, the majority of this yield was prepared for the international export market. One can notice the desert-raised fish appearing on the shelves of major supermarket chains in France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. They began to compete directly with wild-caught fish sourced from the traditional waters of Southeast Asia and Australia. With a guaranteed year-round supply and a cost structure shielded from energy price spikes, the desert product secured a permanent foothold in the global economy. The process is only gaining momentum as the quality remains consistent across every shipment. Yet, this rapid industrial growth brought new technical challenges to the surface. The mineral-rich water provided life, but managing the scale of the waste was the next hurdle in the chain. Thus, the aquaculture sector reached a level of maturity ready for the next phase of integration. 3% of their total body weight is the exact amount of feed every fish in these intensive aquaculture systems consumes on a daily basis. When a single pond contains hundreds of thousands of individual fish, the volume of organic material entering the environment becomes massive. Why must these vast quantities of feed be managed with such extreme precision? One might assume that excess feed simply settles or dissolves without consequence. But in reality, any organic matter not absorbed by the fish is rapidly broken down and converted into ammonia, a chemical compound that is highly toxic to aquatic life. This creates a biological crisis within the tanks that requires immediate technical intervention. Ammonia concentrations exceeding just 2 parts per million cause the gills of the fish to suffer physical damage. The nervous system of the animals weakens as the chemical levels rise, and mortality rates begin to climb sharply across the entire population. In traditional aquaculture models, this specific threshold is where heavy technological intervention becomes mandatory. Engineers must install complex mechanical and biological filtration arrays combined with systems for continuous water circulation and aeration. These industrial solutions are effective at maintaining life, but they function at a staggering financial and energy cost. One can notice how the electricity consumption of these filtration units often equals the power requirements of dozens of local households. This energy demand drives operating expenses upward, making the entire production cycle increasingly expensive. In marine aquaculture, a common alternative is to discharge the polluted wastewater directly into the open ocean. The waste is diluted by the vast volume of the sea, effectively trading environmental contamination for the short-term survival of the commercial fish stock. But in the Negev desert, this logistical option does not exist for the producers. It is visible how the arid landscape offers no sea for the discharge of industrial waste. Even more critically, there is no surplus water to be wasted in such an extreme environment. At first glance, the situation appeared to be a dead end where the fish tanks were gradually suffocating from their own accumulated waste. Simultaneously, nearby olive groves and date palms were lacking the very nutrients the desert soil provides in such limited quantities. This contrast between a surplus of waste and a deficit of nutrients led researchers at Ben Gurion University to initiate a bold technical experiment. Everything only gets more complicated when dealing with saline water sources. Instead of treating the wastewater from the fish tanks as a byproduct to be processed and discarded, the team decided to channel the nitrogen-rich water directly into irrigation lines for salt-tolerant crops. The results of this direct integration exceeded the initial technical expectations of the researchers. Olive trees and date palms were not only unharmed by the elevated salinity, but they actively absorbed the organic matter from the fish waste as a highly effective natural fertilizer. 15 to 20% was the recorded increase in olive yields during these controlled experiments. Furthermore, the oil content within the fruit reached higher levels compared to trees grown using traditional irrigation methods. The process is only gaining momentum as the quality of the harvest improves. Dates grown in the Negev became physically larger and significantly sweeter, quickly establishing themselves as premium products on the international markets. These fruits often sell for 20 to 30% more than dates harvested from conventional growing regions around the world. This specific model is technically defined as integrated aqua agriculture. At its core, the facility operates as a strictly closed-loop system where every resource is recycled. Hot saline water is pumped from deep underground to raise fish in tanks monitored by automated sensors. Once the water has absorbed the necessary nutrients from the fish, it is not discarded but is channeled through a complex network of pipes to the nearby fields. Transition to the next level occurs at the irrigation manifold. Drip irrigation technology delivers exactly the required volume of water to each individual plant in the grove. One can notice how the equipment prevents loss from evaporation and eliminates surface runoff or waste. The same water that supports the fish population nourishes the crops and is gradually purified through the soil before returning to the ground. The system functions like a living, intelligent organism where every mechanical and biological component supports the others. It gets more complex further on as the system simultaneously addresses the three greatest challenges of desert life: food production, water scarcity, and waste management. By the year 2024, this integrated fish agriculture model had significantly increased the total agricultural output in the Negev. It has now become a central pillar of the national food security strategy. In the face of intensifying global climate change, the technical value of this integrated system extends far beyond the production of food alone. The material cycle concludes this phase, opening the road to long-term sustainable cultivation in the most arid regions of the planet. 100% of a project's success in the modern industrial landscape is now measured by its carbon sustainability. The Negev system achieves this by extracting naturally heated groundwater from depths of hundreds of meters, which allows for the total removal of traditional heating systems from the fish farming cycle. Why is this thermal extraction so critical for the environment? Aquaculture heating represents one of the primary sources of carbon emissions within the global fishing industry. By utilizing the Earth's internal heat, the system bypasses the need for fossil fuel combustion entirely. It is visible how the steaming water enters the tanks, maintaining a constant temperature without a single kilowatt of external energy. Everything only gets more complicated when considering the secondary use of this resource. Nutrient-rich wastewater from the fish tanks flows directly into irrigation channels for nearby crops. This process significantly lowers the requirement for synthetic chemical fertilizers, which in turn reduces the massive energy expenditure and fossil fuel consumption typically associated with agricultural manufacturing. At first glance, this cycle appears to be a localized environmental solution, but in reality, it has fundamentally altered the economic structure of the entire territory. A region that was once categorized as a national financial burden has been reconfigured into a high-value industrial production hub. But this is just the beginning. The desert now exports premium barramundi, tilapia, and high-grade olive oil to elite markets in New York and London. Detailed economic analyses demonstrate that this integrated model generates a financial return per cubic meter of water that is 10 times higher than that of traditional open field farming. The equipment gradually monitors the flow of this liquid gold as it passes from the hatcheries to the groves. Transition to the next level. The Negev has now transitioned into a global blueprint for arid zones stretching from the state of Arizona to the vast deserts of the Middle East. One can notice how the infrastructure integrates seamlessly into the barren landscape, proving that harsh conditions are not an absolute barrier to production. Yet, a technical uncertainty persists regarding the long-term viability of the source. Can the global community maintain this equilibrium when fossil water reserves are inherently finite and non-renewable? The story of this desert is not a mere account of fish husbandry or the cultivation of crops in the sand. It serves as a physical testament to the capacity for adaptation and the pushing of mechanical and biological limits under extreme thermal stress. By converting saline water, intense solar heat, and sterile sand into industrial advantages, the technological framework has redefined the standards of sustainable agriculture. The camera glides along the massive pipelines that tap into the subterranean ocean, which has become a symbol of engineering hope in a global environment characterized by rising temperatures and dwindling resources. This concludes the current observation of the integrated desert production model as the system continues its steady operation.